I think it's really important for your marriage for you to set good boundaries for your ministry, and you know, I think, I think of it somewhat like as a river, right? I mean, you can have a river that's beautiful and powerful and do a lot of things, but if it floods the banks, it destroys everything. And so you just have to have good boundaries in there, and we just really have to work at that pretty hard. And one of the things that so when I was down at the church in Hanover, this is back in the late 1980s, and we had our first child. And I remember we just had a couple of three deacons at that point. The church was 50 people and that kind of thing. And I and I remember saying to the deacons, I said, I'm trying to figure this out, in terms of what's the right flow. And after a brief conversation, they said, we don't want you out except for under extraordinary circumstances. We don't want you out more than 2 nights a week on ministry stuff.
So grateful for that.
Outside of Sunday night, we were still doing Sunday night services then. Outside of Sunday night, when it came to Monday through Saturday, they didn't want me out more than 2 nights a week. And I was really grateful for that because as a young guy, a young pastor, I was in my 20s. We can, we're out 3, 4, 5 nights a week. We feel like we have to visit everybody, do everything, be at every Bible study, lead every Bible study, all that kind of stuff. And it was helpful. And we've done that off and on. I mean, we here at Hope Chapel, there were times, we used to do men's breakfasts almost every month. And, but there would be times like, all right, I had a couple of weddings and I had or a funeral, or I had, a denominational event or whatever I went to on a Saturday, and I just wouldn't come. I mean,
Or
there,
we had family that we had plans to spend time with, and we
right.
just did that.
So,
And
so, so,
yeah,
so some of that is not taking yourself too seriously, not developing this complex, if you will, which just suffocates all the other priorities in your marriage, in your life, including your marriage. So,
and really, I'll just
yeah,
close this
all
section with
right,
this one comment is that church ministry and leadership is so immersive in nature anyway, but we've got to, in terms of marriage, cultivate some kind of life outside of church. Like said, it's our identity, and one kind of impacts and shapes the other, but we've got to do something that's not church related, and being on staff together, it adds is an added challenge because there's a lot of off hours calls and conversations, and so we've literally had to say, hey, this is we're out to dinner right now, let's just not talk about this. Sorry. I
right.
mean, that seems obvious, but you really have to
Yep.
draw those riverbanks,
Or
and
when
so
you're out for a
appreciate
walk or
that
whatever.
imagery.
So here's a next one, and this is one definitely we're looking back at and say, boy, we're just grateful that instinctively we did this. But in ministry, I mean, you clearly deal with some marriages that are in trouble. That people come to you, their marriages are not healthy, they're really struggling, and et cetera. And especially as a number of marriages that you're serving get larger and there's more and more of those, you're more likely to see that. So over the years, all of my years of ministry, and I've seen this in pastors' lives and in a regular married life, is it's the marriages that have the hardest time of really kind of it's often that they find themselves at a breaking point and they're really not sure they want to be married. The ones that's harder to recover from that are the ones who suffer from, and I'm going to use an interesting, at least to me, imagery here. They're carrying a backpack full of pebbles as opposed to trying to carry one big boulder. We had a couple of scenarios
But the
where,
weight is
yeah,
overwhelming,
yeah. So
the
what I mean by
cumulative weight.
sometimes you deal with marriage where there's been infidelity or some other kind of major breach of
Catastrophic.
trust, and actually sometimes it's easier to forgive that and heal from that and move forward than just having just weekly, all kinds of little disagreements, misunderstandings, miscommunications, not being on the same
Harbored
page, whatever.
resentment.
And
Yeah.
it just chips away at trust. And then all of a sudden they find themselves to the point where they don't trust their spouse anymore with their well-being. And it's really hard to be one with somebody you don't trust. And those pebbles comes in all kinds of little fashions, whether it's forgetting to pick up the milk on your way home, or just chronically being late after you've said, I won't do that anymore.
Mhm.
Yeah.
There's,
Yeah.
some of the scenarios we dealt with, were, and I don't want to be very specific because I don't want to call anybody out, but just, scenarios where, one spouse says, all right, I'll take over paying the bills and take care of it. And then they're just late on all kinds of payments. And, they say they forget to put things on their calendars and don't protect the time and can't get to family events. And, just all this little stuff just chips away over and over again. And before you know it, they're carrying this backpack that's, got 500 pounds of pebbles in it. And it's a whole lot harder to go through and try to forgive for every single little pebble than it is for
Mhm.
one big boulder. You know what I mean?
Uh,
And so I think the couple of thoughts, and Christina's going to expand on this, but a couple of thoughts that really stand out to me that's so important for thriving in ministry and in marriage, and having ministry really add to your marriage, and vice versa, is one, you really need to focus on communication. And you need to, you don't assume that it's taken place, but make sure that you've really heard each other, and you resolve stuff in the short run.
Yeah.
And the other thing that's really just stood out to me is just how important trust is. And trust isn't just limited to the fact that Christina is the only one that I am physically intimate with. It goes with it. That trustworthiness goes to how I treat her family, how I treat my family, how I treat the boys, how I talk about parishioners, to the way that I deal with
How you
people
speak with
across, all that
integrity,
kind of stuff
and
is.
recalling events in ways that are
And
true and honest.
and
Yeah.
just and if there's something, it may not be hugely important, but if it's significant enough that it's going to bother them or you, make sure you actually come up with a common decision, not just.
Otherwise, you have another pebble to add to
That's
the.
right. And we've dealt with numbers of marriages over the years where it's just the little things that have added up. They couldn't agree on what to do with the kids, or how to do
Oh,
this or do that,
oh,
or what they were going to spend money on, et cetera. And when they were going to get in, and there's all this stuff that goes on, and after a while they just don't really trust one another anymore, and it just eats away at oneness. So you just got to avoid the pebbles. You got to have the time regularly to settle the things that are going to have an impact, even if they're not life-changing decisions. You still have to be on the same page.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what's next. Want to support the work we're doing in New England? Check out the link in the description.